Okay, so this morning we're going to look at the book of Esther, and today's sermon is titled For Such a Time as This. I was going to go into a long monologue of what Esther is about, but luckily the Bible Project did it for me. So what we'll do is we'll watch a little short video from the Bible Project, and then hopefully I will share my utter wisdom and knowledge on this subject. Yeah, if we can play that one. Thank you.
The Book of Esther. It's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. And the main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once. Which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days. And it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called Pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther is going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all she's Jewish, and second that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story, Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral examples, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began, why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history. And he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
So, got it? It's only a short little book. And you can see why I didn't do that and they did. So it's not just about Esther as a queen in this bit. We get to see Mordecai and all the other people. And what the Bible Project didn't say there is that Mordecai is Esther's uncle. And we don't know what happened to her parents, but apparently they disappeared. And maybe they went back to Jerusalem to rebuild it. I don't know. Who knows? It didn't say, so I can't tell you. But it's a complex story. Esther's a young girl. The other thing that it doesn't tell you is how old Esther is, but we can surmise that Esther is only a teenager because most girls of that age were married off quite early. So we can guess that maybe Esther's about, 15, 16 years old when she becomes queen. It's a complex thing to be a young girl in that situation. Even today, if it were to happen, it would be absolutely crazy. But back then, I would imagine it was totally daunting for a young girl to be thrust into that position. Luckily, we're not looking at the whole of the book of Esther today. We're focusing on chapter 4, verse 13 to 17. Hopefully, it's going to come up on the next slide, maybe, if it works. It's not working yet. Click. There we go. Oh, okay. Okay. Before we do that, we'll do this. When did it happen? I got the slides mixed up. Good stuff. Well done, Warren. So when did it happen? So this is about 100 years after Jeremiah has been prophesying about how bad people are. I'm going to have to look on there because it's not on there. So Jerusalem and the Jews were taken by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. For those of you who don't know, BC means before Christ. It's not politically correct now. It should be BCE, but I've got no idea what the E stands for, so I just stuck with BC. In 537, some of the Jews returned home after exile. Then in 515, the temple is rebuilt. King Xerxes, who is the king here, reigned between 485 and 465 BC. And so you can see that in 483, Vashti had only been a queen for a couple of years, and he got fed up with her quite quickly. And she gets deposed because, again, she was obviously a strong woman, because you've got to take some guts to stand up to a king and say, no, I'm not coming, you're drunk. I'm not coming to be paraded in front of all your friends. And we don't know what happened to Vashti, whether she was just shoved in a corner somewhere or whether she was killed. I don't know. Maybe. Let's hope that she was just put out to pasture in some other palace somewhere rather than killed. Who knows? But she was a strong lady herself. And then you notice there's a bit of a gap there between Esther becoming queen. That's because she had to go through preparation. The king spotted her, liked what he saw, but it took years of preparation for Esther. When you actually read the story, it took her years to be prepared. You know, it says that there's like a year of preparation of being bathed and being washed and being clothed, and I don't know, maybe she had to learn how to talk because she might not have spoken the king's language. I don't know. It doesn't tell us. But it took a year. And then she becomes queen even, maybe, I don't know. And then there's 6 years between Esther becoming queen and Mordecai becoming elevated. So this isn't a short little boom, boom, boom. This happened 1 week, that happened the next week. It's a prolonged period of time. But we're just looking at chapter 4, verse 13, 17. Hopefully that's, yeah, got it. Right, I'm going to read it out. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." And Mordecai went away, and he did everything as Esther had ordered him. It's a big thing that Mordecai points out to Esther, that you're put there for such a time as this. Maybe you went through all of this that you've gone through just for this one moment in your life. And Esther recognizes that her life is in God's hands. That if I perish, I perish. It's that pivotal moment. I mean, they said it was pivotal with the other bit. I think this is where Esther suddenly becomes her own person. And she realizes that God has had control of her life from the moment of her birth. She says, "If I perish, I perish. It's in God's hands." She doesn't use those words. I'm paraphrasing. It's not in there, just in case. It's about God's perfect timing, really. It really is some things that we don't understand God's timing in our lives. Today we look at things and we think slightly differently. But Esther recognizes that the future is in God's hands, not hers. She can do her part if she's brave enough, and she puts her life in God's hands. But Esther would have also been aware of the prophet Jeremiah and his words. Next slide, hopefully. Because 100 years or so earlier, in 588 BC, Jeremiah had prophesied these words. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." So Esther would have known these words. They would have been taught in the synagogue. She would have heard them spoken. They were prophesied 100 years earlier, or thereabouts. But she knew that God had a future for not just her, but for the Jews. So she would have known that if she fasted, and I would imagine that there's prayer in there somewhere as well, because you don't just stop eating and everything gets better. You stop eating and you communicate why you're doing that to God. You call on the name of God. In their case, it was Yahweh. In our case, it's Jesus. We call on that name when we fast and pray, and we ask God to come into our lives and show us what we should do. But we put our trust in him, that he knows the plans that he has for us. God knows everything. Next slide. Everything we think or do is known by God. Every situation we are in is known by God. Every choice we make is known by God. Everything is in God's perfect timing. We don't understand it, but trust me, it is. Everything is in God's perfect timing. It blows my mind to know this. God has plans and perfect timings. We see this throughout the Bible. Next one. Examples of God's perfect timing. Joseph is one from the earlier in the stories. He's sold into slavery by his brothers, wrongfully accused and thrown into prison, taken out of prison and given a position of second in command in Egypt. Joseph knew that this was his for such a time as this. He knew it in the story. You know, it's unbelievable that God put Joseph through what he put him through. From giving him the dreams as a child, to know that his family and that would bow before him, to being sold into slavery, to going into Egypt, to being put into prison innocently, without, there was no guilt in him. He was thrown into prison, but he was brought out and put into command. And then he says to his brothers that, "Come near to me, please." And they came near. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourself, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." Joseph recognized his for such a time as this. It was God's plan all along. All along. Some other examples. I'm going to spin through these quite quickly because I didn't time this, and so I'm trying to race through. So, John the Baptist, his conception and birth. Bit of a plan there, wasn't it? Zechariah just happens to get chosen to go into the temple, just happens to meet an angel. His wife just happens to not be barren anymore and have a baby. All of these things are God's perfect timing. It was for such a time as this. Mary, in Luke 1, we see that Mary chooses to accept her such a time as this, because she says those words that, if it's God's will, let it be done. She's putting her trust in God because she knows that God has a plan. No doubt Mary was quite worried, being a teenager, being pregnant, being unmarried. I bet she was a little bit anxious, but she knew it was for such a time as this that she was put there. Jesus' birth, when it comes to things like the wise men, they knew exactly for such a time as this. They saw the star, and they all, they travelled a long way. We saw that in our Christmas play, that they travelled all the way down the M3 to get on a boat. But they did. They travelled a long way for such a time as this, to meet a God incarnate. They knew who they were meeting. They didn't just hop on a bus and travel. They travelled a long way with, camels and things. It wasn't easy like it is today. It's all God's perfect timing. Everything is in God's perfect timing. There were some guys, hopefully next slide, God's perfect timing. You may or may not know a guy called Billy Graham. Billy Graham was an evangelist of extraordinary means. He had ears of presidents. He travelled the world. Thousands and thousands of people were converted under Billy Graham's evangelistic tours. But did you know that there was a guy called Albert McMarkin? Albert McMarkin drove a milk float, or a milk truck. And he was the person that invited Billy Graham to go to a meeting where Billy Graham gave his life. And this is a little excerpt from how Billy describes it. Tells of how his friend invited him to his local church to hear an evangelist, Mordecai Ham, No, it's the name, Mordecai. Billy Graham did not want to go, but McMakin said if he went, Graham could drive the milk truck, so he agreed. During the service, Ham invited people to come forward, and these are Billy Graham's words. I felt as if I had lead weights attached to my feet, but I was compelled to go forward. Although I felt no great emotion, I knew I was a new person. I went home and told my mother, "Mother, I'm a changed boy." Albert McMakin knew he's for such a time as this. That was it. Inviting Billy Graham to that meeting was his moment. He drove a milk truck. I'm sure he didn't drive a milk truck every morning going, this is the morning that I'm going to find an evangelist who's going to save thousands of people. But he knew he's such a time as this. Hollywood absolutely loves God's perfect timing. There's a film out a few years ago called Hacksaw Ridge. It's a true story about a guy called Desmond Doss. Desmond Doss was a believer of God, and he refused to pick up a weapon, but he still went into combat as a medic. And Hacksaw Ridge is a place in Okinawa, and basically the Japanese had a stronghold there, and you had to get to this place, you had to go up a cliff, and the Japanese just slaughtered people because they were hidden in the ground, and they would just pop up, kill them all, and drop down again, hidden. No matter what they did, they struggled to take this. And Desmond Doss's unit was ordered up there to go and take this ridge. They needed this in order to take the island. As they went up, they were ambushed, and bearing in mind he didn't have a weapon, and the Japanese popped up, the order to retreat was given. Lots of people ran away to get out, but Desmond stayed because he could hear the cries of the wounded whilst he was on that battlefield, and he carried 75 people that were injured to the safety to get them off that escarpment. He did it without a weapon, and he was injured himself. He was shot by a sniper as he was doing it, but he got 75 people off of there. It's a really good film. It's very moving, very, very moving. But Hollywood loves these sort of stories about God's perfect timing. His perfect timing to put that man there who wasn't fighting but was there to help. He never went into any battle without praying. And there's a story that also, I'm not sure if it's actually in the film, but the true story is in that whilst he was carrying the people back, he dropped his Bible that his wife had given him. And the next time they went up there, his whole unit searched for his Bible and found it for him. And they would not go into battle until he'd prayed for them. So God's perfect timing. Desmond Doss's moment, for such a moment as this, that's where he was put there. Now we look at another one, Superman. Story of an alien who crashes to Earth because his planet is being destroyed. This one isn't necessarily true, not sure. Just happens, perfect timing, isn't it? That his ship crashes in the Midwest of America where there's nobody else about apart from two people driving along in a truck who desperately want a child but haven't had one. And they live on a remote farm, so no one's going to know. And so they get this child and they think, oh, it's a gift from God. I've got a child. He's come in this thing. And they pick up this child and they raise him as their own. And then Superman, he grows up into be because he's an alien and he can fly around and he's very strong. But he's seen as a savior. Just when you think that things are going to be bad, all these superheroes rely on perfect timing. They go through some peril or hardship, and then it's just when you think it's too late, they'll swoop in and be a saviour. Sort of reminds me of this guy called Jesus. Swoops in and be the saviour of your life. So another bit of perfect timing. If we go next. Right, you might know you don't know these people. They're from a little place in just outside Watford called Bushy. And one of them is called Georges Panos, his name was. And this other guy called Andrew. Now, when Georges moved to Bushy, he went to a school, and the teacher said to someone, he needs, he's new in the country, he's new here, can someone please be a friend to him? And this guy called Andrew puts up his hand and says, yes, I'll be a friend to him. And he was a friend to him for a very long time. They were best friends. Andrew knew that was for such a time as this that he was put there. Because they went on to form a band in the 1980s. Next one. Georges changed his name because he didn't think it was a very good pop star name to have. He didn't think it rolled off his tongue, so he became George Michael. For such a time as this, Andrew Ridgely put up his hand and had a best friend for life. And they did some amazing things. They did great stuff. They were a bit older than me, so I didn't know them. My brother knew them, and some of my friends knew them. But they come from where I come from, and they went to a school I went to Bushy Hall School, they went to Bushy Mead School. There was always a bit of rivalry between those two schools, but these guys went on to do amazing things. But their point was, for such a time as this. Andrew put his hand up to be a friend. He didn't know when he was 13 that he was putting his hand up to become a multi-millionaire and a superstar who'd fly all over the world and do amazing things. And he didn't for sure know that his best friend was going to be who he was. But it was his moment. Next page. There we go. I've had many of these moments in my life, personally, loads of them. Too many to even, I'd be here for hours and hours and I've got 3 minutes, so too many to name. But one time I was driving down the motorway very early in the morning, and I used to work on the mainland, so I used to get the 4 o'clock ferry, and this particular one had not long moved here. I'd been plastering my kitchen the night before, and I'd finished that at 2 o'clock, and I got on the 4 o'clock ferry, and I was driving on the M3, and I was very sleepy. And for some unknown reason, my son phoned me. Just as the moment I felt my eyes were going like this, and I was going to fall asleep. And he phoned me, and he talked to me until I got in the services. God's perfect timings. Joe didn't know that I was doing that. And Joe, if you knew my son Joe, he never gets up that early in the morning, ever. Doesn't matter what he's doing. But he phoned me at just the right time. God's perfect timings. I believe that Jesus had one of these moments. I'm hoping that the next one is yes. So in the garden, Jesus is praying, and I'm going to go quite quickly through this, but Jesus is praying in the garden, Father, please take this cup from me. I can't do it. And I really hope that God was saying back to him, Jesus, son, it was for such a time as this that you were put on the earth. And obviously we know what happens. Jesus says, your will be done. We need to apply this sort of thinking in our lives. We need to know when God speaks to us that there will be times when we'll be required to be an Albert McMakin or an Andrew Ridgely, that we put our hand up and we talk to people and we say something or we do what we have to do. So how do we apply it? How do we learn to do this? When we learn to recognize the Holy Spirit talks to us. Next one. We read the word. We pray. And we listen. God gave us 2 eyes that we can read. He gave us 2 ears that we can listen. But he only gave us 1 mouth that we can pray. So the more important of those is to read and listen. Praying's important, but listen to God. Give yourself space to listen to what he's saying once you've read and you've prayed. Can't remember if there's a next one. Yeah. So, for such a time as this. Could be today is your for such a time as this. If you have never given your life to Christ, if you have never made that decision, today could be that day that you go, I want to do that. I want to follow Christ. I want to put my life in God's hands and let him tell me for such a time as this. So that's it. Look at that, a minute over.